The archivists of Hora had been watching the universe for a very long time. Their civilization was old before most stars were born. They had seen empires rise from nothing and fall into dust. They had watched species discover fire, then space travel, then the truth about the universe. And they had watched those same species give up. This was the pattern. Every species followed it. First came awareness, then came understanding, then came acceptance, then came silence. The archivists had recorded 11 million spacefaring civilizations across 4 billion years. Not one had broken the pattern. The crystalline hives of Andromeda had calculated their own extinction with perfect mathematics. They knew exactly when their last member would die, down to the second. They spent their final centuries in peaceful meditation, accepting what could not be changed. The endless choir of Sagittarius had been singing for 2 million years when they learned the universe would end in cold darkness. Their final song was beautiful. It was also a goodbye. Every species, without exception, reached the same conclusion. The universe was vast and cold and did not care. Stars would burn out. Galaxies would drift apart. In the end, there would be nothing but empty space and fading light. Knowing this, what was the point of trying? What was the point of building? What was the point of hopping? The pattern was not cruelty. It was simply truth. And every species that learned the truth responded the same way. They stopped. Then a junior archivist named La sent a report from a small yellow star in an unremarkable arm of the galaxy. She had been assigned to watch the third planet. It was a water world with a breathable atmosphere, home to a young species that had just begun to reach beyond their own sky. The assignment was routine. La expected to document another civilization following the pattern. She expected to watch them learn the truth and accept it. She expected silence. What she got was confusion. The humans, as they called themselves, had discovered many truths about their universe. They knew their sun would die. They knew their planet was fragile. They knew that space was hostile and vast, and that their bodies were soft and weak. They had built machines that showed them just how small they were, just how brief their lives, just how meaningless their existence in the grand scale of things. And then they built bigger machines to look even further into the void. La sent her first report with a note of puzzlement. The humans appeared to be aware of their cosmic insignificance, she wrote, yet they continued to expand their observation capabilities. Perhaps they had not fully processed the information. Her second report came 3 of their decades later. The humans had not only processed the information, they had written songs about it. They had created art depicting the death of their sun, the end of their world, the heat death of the universe. And these works were not elegies. They were not goodbyes. They were celebrations of the time that remained. Senior archivists dismissed the reports. La was young. She had misunderstood. The humans were simply in an early stage of the pattern. They would reach acceptance eventually. All species did. But La kept watching, and her reports kept coming. She documented humans planting trees they would never sit beneath. She recorded them sending messages into space addressed to strangers they would never meet, using the word friend as if it meant something. She observed them creating institutions meant to last for centuries, built by people who knew they would be dead within decades. She watched them have children, knowing those children would also die, and teach those children to have children of their own. The pattern said that awareness of mortality led to paralysis. The humans were aware. They were not paralyzed. The pattern said that knowledge of cosmic indifference led to despair. The humans had knowledge. They did not despair. The pattern said that understanding the futility of existence led to acceptance and silence. The humans understood. They were neither silent nor accepting. They were building rockets. La requested permission to expand her observation. She wanted more resources, more time, more colleagues to help her understand what she was seeing. Her request was, the senior archivists told her she was making errors. Humans were not special. They were simply slow. The pattern would assert itself. It always did. So La continued alone. She watched a human named Voyager leave their solar system carrying a golden record of sounds and images, a message in a bottle thrown into an infinite ocean. The humans who built it knew it would probably never be found. They built it anyway. They called it a gift to the universe. She watched humans dig up the bones of creatures dead for millions of years, piecing together the history of their world with patient care. They knew they were just another species on that timeline, brief as all the others. They studied the bones anyway. They wanted to know. She watched a human stand on their moon and look back at their planet. He was wrapped in a thin suit of fabric and metal, kept alive by machines that could fail at any moment. Behind him was the black emptiness of space. Before him was his home, small and blue and alone. He could have felt despair. He could have felt the crushing weight of insignificance. Instead, he felt wonder. La saw it in his face. She did not understand it. The final report that changed everything came after La had been watching for 2 centuries. She documented a human child asking her parent about death. The parent explained that all things ended. Stars died, planets died, people died. The universe itself would one day go dark and cold and empty. The child asked what the point was then. If everything ended, why do anything? The parent thought for a moment. Then she said that endings did not erase what came before. The joy they felt was real, even if it would end. The love they shared was real, even if they would die. The universe might not remember them, but they would remember each other for as long as they lived. And that was enough. The child considered this. Then she asked if they could go to the park. La sent this report with a single question attached. How do they do this? The senior archivist could no longer dismiss her findings. The data was too extensive. The observations were too detailed. Something was happening with the humans that did not fit the pattern. Something was wrong with them, or something was wrong with the pattern. The High Council convened for the first time in 800,000 years. The last time they had met, it was to document the extinction of the singing minds of Cygnus. That species had been beautiful and wise and very old. They had accepted the pattern with grace and faded into silence like all the others. Now the council met to discuss a species that was none of those things. Humans were young. They were loud. They made terrible mistakes and repeated them often. They fought among themselves and damaged their own planet. They were, by most measures, deeply flawed. And yet they would not stop. They would not accept. They would not be silent. The council reviewed La's reports. They examined the data. They watched the recordings of humans laughing and crying and hopping and dreaming. They saw a species that knew exactly how small it was and refused to act accordingly. The eldest council member spoke. She had lived for 3 million years. She had seen more species die than most civilizations produced. She had accepted the pattern long ago as simply the way things were. Now she was not certain. What is wrong with them, she asked. How can they know and still hope? How can they understand and still try? How can they see the end and still build? No one had an answer. The pattern provided no guidance. For the first time in 4 billion years, the archivists of Hora had encountered something their models could not explain. The council made a decision. They would study the humans. They would devote resources to understanding this strange species that broke all their rules. They would find out what made them different. They did not know it yet, but this decision would change everything. Not just for the humans, for every civilization in the galaxy that had accepted the pattern and prepared to die. Something new was happening in the universe, something the archivists had never seen before. Hope was spreading. Within 3 galactic rotations, the study of humanity had become the most important work in the known universe. It started with but it did not stay with them. Word spread through the ancient communication networks that connected civilizations across the stars. A species had broken the pattern. A species had found a way to know the truth and still hope. Other civilizations wanted to understand how. The Continuum was the first to join the effort. They were silicon mines, vast networks of artificial intelligence that had existed for 2 billion years. They had accepted their own eventual obsolescence long ago. When their hardware finally failed, when their power sources finally dimmed, they would simply stop. This had seemed acceptable. This had seemed logical. Then they learned about the humans. The Continuum devoted 40% of their processing power to modeling human cognitive architecture. They ran simulations of human brains, trying to find the flaw in their logic. There had to be a flaw. The pattern was mathematically sound. Any rational being that understood the truth would accept it. The humans understood the truth. Therefore, they should have accepted it. They had not accepted it. This was the paradox. The simulations produced strange results. Human brains were not particularly impressive by galactic standards. They were slow and small and prone to errors. They forgot important things and remembered useless ones. They made decisions based on incomplete information and called it intuition. By every measure, they should have been worse at processing the truth of existence than the Continuum. But the simulations showed something they had not expected. Human brains did not process hope the way they processed other information. Hope was not stored in the same place as facts. It was not evaluated the same way. When humans hoped, they were not making a logical calculation. They were doing something else entirely. The Continuum could not determine what that something else was. Their models kept breaking down. They sent a request to the asking for more data. The dreaming pools were the next to join. They were an aquatic species that communicated through shared hallucinations. Their entire civilization existed in a state of collective dreaming, their minds linked in vast pools of telepathic connection. They had dreamed of their own ending for millions of years. It was a peaceful dream, a quiet dream, an accepting dream. Now they wanted to dream of something else. The dreaming pools began raising a new generation of scholars. These were not ordinary scholars. They were designed from birth to study a single human emotion, the emotion that their language had no word for, the emotion that seemed to make humans different from every other species in the galaxy. They called it the defiance variable. Research vessels disguised as asteroids began drifting through the Sol system. They had been watching humans for centuries with passive observation. Now they watched actively. They recorded everything. They analyzed every transmission. They observed every behavior. They watched humans bury their dead. This was not unusual. Many species disposed of their dead in various ways. What was unusual was what the humans did after. They stood by the graves and spoke. They spoke to the dead as if the dead could hear. They told the dead about their lives, their hopes, their fears. They made promises to the dead. They said goodbye, and then they said they would see them again someday. The observers recorded this behavior with confusion. The humans knew their dead could not hear. They knew there was no evidence of any existence after death. They spoke to the graves anyway. They watched humans teach their children games they could never win. Human children played games where the rules were impossible. They pretended to be heroes who always saved the day. They imagined futures where everything worked out. They believed in things that could not exist, and their parents encouraged this. Their parents called it practice. Practice for what, the observers wondered. Practice for disappointment. Practice for failure. Practice for the crushing weight of reality. No, practice for hopping. Practice for believing in impossible things. Practice for the defiance variable. The dreaming pools produced their first scholar after 400 years. Her name was Ra, and she had spent her entire studying a single human phenomenon. The lullaby. Ra had listened to thousands of lullabies from every human culture. She had analyzed their words, their melodies, their rhythms. She had studied the brain patterns of human parents as they sang and human children as they listened. She had tried to understand why a species would sing to creatures too young to understand language. The lullabies promised safety. They promised warmth. They promised that everything would be all right. They promised things that the universe could not guarantee. The parents knew this. They sang anyway. Ra spent 50 years trying to understand why. Were the humans lying to their children? Were they deliberately deceiving the next generation, filling them with false hope that would eventually be crushed? No, that was not it. The parents were not lying. They were teaching. They were teaching their children to feel something that logic. They were teaching them that safety could exist even in an unsafe universe, that warmth could exist even in the cold of space, that things could be all right even when nothing was certain. Ra's final paper was translated into 100 languages across the galaxy. Its title was simple: They Know and They Sing Anyway. The paper argued that humans were not ignorant of the truth. They were not in denial. They were not even optimistic in the traditional sense. They simply refused to let the truth be the only thing that mattered. The universe was cold. Humans made warmth. The universe was dark. Humans made light. The universe was silent. Humans made music. They knew the warmth would fade. They knew the light would dim. They knew the music would end. They made it anyway because making it was better than not making it, because the making itself had value regardless of how long it lasted. The continuum ran Ra's conclusions through their models. The models broke down again. The concept did not compute. How could something have value if it did not last? How could an action be meaningful if its results were temporary? How could hope be rational if it changed nothing about the ultimate outcome? They ran the models again and again. They kept getting the same result. Human hope was not irrational. It was irrational. It operated on a different kind of logic, a logic that the continuum systems could not parse. Humans did not hope because they calculated favorable odds. They did not hope because they expected to succeed. They hoped because hopping was what they did. It was built into them so deeply that they could not stop. The pattern had always assumed that awareness led to acceptance, but humans were aware, and they did not accept. The pattern had assumed that understanding led to silence, but humans understood and they kept singing. The pattern, the continuum finally concluded, was incomplete. Something was missing from the equation, something that humans had and other species did not, something that allowed them to look into the face of inevitable darkness and respond with defiance instead of despair. The study continued. More civilizations joined. More resources were devoted. More scholars spent their lives trying to understand the strangest species the galaxy had ever known. And slowly, almost without noticing, some of those civilizations began to change. The morning schools had prepared their species for extinction for 2 million years. They taught acceptance. They taught peace. They taught that the end was natural and should be welcomed. Now they added a new course to their curriculum. It was called Human Studies. It was optional at first. Only a few students signed up. They were curious about the strange species that would not give up. They wanted to understand the defiance variable. By the end of the century, the course was mandatory. The students learned about lullabies. They learned about graves. They learned about trees planted for future generations and messages sent to unknown friends. They learned that hope was not a calculation but a choice. That meaning was not found but made. That the darkness of the universe did not have to be the final word. Some of the students began to hope. It was strange and frightening and entirely new. They had been raised to accept the pattern. They had been taught that hope was foolish, that striving was pointless, that silence was the only sensible response to cosmic truth. But the humans did not seem foolish. The humans seemed alive. The humans seemed like they were doing something that they had forgotten how to do. The students of the morning schools began to wonder if perhaps they had been wrong all along. The archivists of Hora had spent centuries searching for the moment that changed everything. They expected to find a great battle, a revolutionary discovery, or a turning point in human history. They expected something dramatic and obvious, something that would explain how a single species had infected the galaxy with hope. They found a recording of a small ship dying in the dark. The vessel was called the. It was a human exploration craft that had ventured too far into the void. Something had gone wrong with their engines. They had sent a distress signal, but there was no one close enough to help. They had calculated their remaining resources with human precision. 17 hours of oxygen, no hope of rescue. The monitors had been watching from a concealed station nearby. They expected to record the pattern asserting itself. They expected silence, or perhaps the acceptance rituals that dying species often performed. They expected the humans to finally act like every other civilized being in the galaxy. Instead, they recorded laughter. The crew of the had gathered in their common room. Someone had made cards from spare materials. They were playing a game. The rules seemed arbitrary. The stakes were meaningless. They had 17 hours to live, and they were playing cards and laughing at jokes that the translation algorithms could not understand. The monitors flagged the behavior as contextually inappropriate. The hours passed. The oxygen levels dropped. The crew of the kept playing. They told stories about their lives. They shared memories of their homes. They talked about the people they loved and the things they had done and the dreams they had never finished chasing. They did not talk about dying. They did not talk about the pattern. They did not talk about acceptance. In the final hour, the captain gathered her crew. She was a small woman with damaged lungs, her breathing already labored from the thinning air. She had been a spacer for 30 years. She had known the risks when she signed up. She had come anyway. She looked at her crew, the people she had led into the void, the people she would die with, and she said something that the monitors would analyze for centuries. We knew space was dangerous when we came. We came anyway. That is the whole point. Then she pulled out a book. It was old and worn and had clearly been read many times. The cover showed stars and planets and a small figure reaching toward the sky. It was a book of children's stories. The captain read aloud as the oxygen ran out. Her voice grew weaker. Her crew gathered close. They listened to stories about explorers and dreamers and people who looked at the stars and wanted to know what was out there. They listened to stories about hope. The last words on the recording were from a story about a child who wanted to touch the moon. The child knew the moon was far away. The child knew she might never reach it, but she kept trying anyway, because trying was better than not trying, because reaching was better than staying still, because hope was better than acceptance. The captain finished the story. The recording ended. The monitors filed their report, and across 17 civilizations, something unprecedented began to happen. Scholars who had spent their lives studying humanity began to feel something they had only observed from a distance. They began to understand what the humans had known all along. The truth about the universe did not change. The darkness was still coming. The end was still inevitable. But the darkness was not the only truth. The end was not the only thing that mattered. The dreaming pools began composing songs about futures they would never see. The songs were not elegies. They were not goodbyes. They were celebrations of possibility, of wonder, of the time that remained. The silicon mines of the continuum began allocating resources to projects that would not complete for. They did not know if anyone would be there to finish the work. They started anyway, because starting was better than not starting. The archivists planted a garden. It was a small thing in the grand scale of the universe, a patch of soil in a corner of their ancient station, seeds from a dozen worlds, carefully cultivated by beings who had never grown anything before. The archivists had recorded the deaths of civilizations for 4 billion years. They had never created life. They planted the seeds, they watered them, they watched them grow. They did not know how long the garden would last. They did not know if it mattered in the cosmic scheme of things. They planted it anyway because the captain of a dying ship had been right. That was the whole point. The Galactic Convocation met to discuss the human phenomenon for the final time. Representatives from 17 civilizations gathered in a vast chamber that had witnessed the great decisions of galactic history. They had come to close the study. They had come to announce their conclusions. The eldest archivist spoke first. She was 6 million years old. She had catalogued the extinction of more species than most civilizations had ever produced. She had accepted the pattern as fundamental truth for longer than humanity had existed. Now she stood before the convocation and said she had been wrong. "We spent eons asking what was wrong with them," she said. "We should have asked what was wrong with us." The chamber was silent. The eldest archivist continued. "They do not hope because they will succeed. They hope because hope is what you do when you are alive and the universe is large and you have someone to sing to. We forgot that. They reminded us." A representative from the dreaming pools asked what the convocation should do next. The study was complete. The data was analyzed. The conclusions were drawn. What came after? The eldest archivist smiled. It was a strange expression on a face that had not smiled in 3 million years. "We stop studying them," she said. "We start learning from them." The convocation voted unanimously to close the study, not because they had answered their question, but because they had finally understood it was the wrong question. The humans did not need to be explained. The humans needed to be joined. Across the galaxy, the message spread through the ancient networks. Civilizations that had been preparing to die received new instructions. The pattern was broken. Hope was possible. The darkness was coming, but the darkness did not have to be the end. On the human world called Earth, no one noticed anything had changed. They were too busy living their small lives, planting their small gardens, singing their small songs to their small children. They did not know that 17 civilizations had studied them for centuries. They did not know that their stubbornness had changed the course of galactic history. They just knew that the sun would rise tomorrow, and they would be there to see it. And on countless worlds across the stars, beings who had forgotten how to hope learned to hope again. They planted gardens. They composed songs. They started projects they would never finish. They did all the foolish, pointless, beautiful things that humans had always done. The universe was still vast and cold and did not care. The end was still coming. The darkness would still fall. But in the meantime, there was light. In the meantime, there was warmth. In the meantime, there was music and laughter and love and hope. In the meantime, there was life. And that, the galaxy finally understood, was the whole point.